Bonjour et bienvenue à cette conférence de presse. I'm Elizabeth Thompson with CBC News. Avec nous aujourd'hui, on a 4 personnes qui vont nous parler. NDP MP Heather McPherson, Blake Desjarlais, the party's critic for post-secondary education, Brenda Austin-Smith, president of the Canadian Association of University Teachers, and Marie Dolcetti-Koros, treasurer of the Canadian Federation of Students. They will be making a statement, and then we will go to questions first in the room and then over Zoom. Ms. McPherson?
Thank you so much. Well, thank you everyone for being here today. Thank you to those who are joining us online. It is a great pleasure to be with you today and to be having what is in effect the Alberta caucus. The 2 members of the NDP from Alberta. I'm joined today by Member of Parliament Blake Desjarlais, who is, of course, the member for Edmonton-Griesbach. I'm also joined by Marie Dolcetti-Koros from the Canadian Federation of Students and Brenda Austin-Smith from the Canadian Association of University Teachers. Today, everyone, I was extremely proud to table Bill C-260. It is the Canadian Post-Secondary Education Act. To give you a very brief explanation of that act, it is a piece of framework legislation that creates a separate post-secondary financial transfer to the provinces. This is an important first step in increasing funding for post-secondary education and ensuring that qualifying criteria are met by provinces in order to receive the federal funding. As many of you will know, at one time, the federal government was an equal partner in funding with the provinces in providing support for higher education, but over the last 2 decades, much has changed. Federal transfers for post-secondary education are down 40%, less per student than they were 25 years ago. And over that same time, we have seen provincial funding declining as well. Alberta is a prime example. In Alberta, in the past 3 years, provincial governments have slashed post-secondary education funding. 1,500 faculty and staff have been laid off, and tuition fees have been raised by nearly $400 million. But it's not just Alberta. This is a problem that is affecting students, staff, and professors across Canada. Post-secondary institutions in this country are struggling. Last year, Laurentian University had to file for creditor protection. And this means that there are higher costs for students, higher costs for post-secondary institutions, and unfair labor practices for faculty and staff. Universities and colleges are increasingly resorting to precarious forms of employment, putting thousands of workers at risk and putting them into insecure, temporary, casual, or contracted out positions. What Bill 260 does is it allows for the federal government to once again be a player in post-secondary education. It ties strings to the funding that we give to the province, and that includes things like limiting federal funding to non-profit institutions, preventing outside entities, including donors, from exercising undue influence over research, curriculum, and employment decisions, limiting the use of short-term contracts and casual labor, and ensuring reasonable access to academically capable students, regardless of their ability to pay. Post-secondary education is the key to our economy. It is the key to going forward in the 21st century, and this bill is a critical first step to restoring the federal role in post-secondary education. I'd now invite the critic for post-secondary education, MP Blake Desjarlais, to make some comments.
Tansei, friends, and I first want to thank my honourable colleague, the MP for Edmonton Strathcona, Heather McPherson. Not only is she a fierce advocate for post-secondary in our province of Alberta, but also for our entire country. Canada's Post-Secondary Education Act is something that, also known as Bill C-260, is something that Canadians need. This legislation is the first crucial step to restoring the federal government's role in post-secondary education by creating a dedicated post-secondary education transfer to the provinces. I was proud to second it this morning as the NDP's critic for post-secondary education, and I call on all my parliamentarian colleagues to support this bill. The reality is that the current funding model for our universities and colleges simply isn't working. It isn't working for our economy, which depends on having strong universities and colleges. It isn't working for faculty or education workers who are increasingly struggling with layoffs, wage cuts, and outsourcing. It isn't working for international students, many of whom are from working class backgrounds, who pay astronomical tuition fees to make up for the public funding cuts that are hollowing out our post-secondary institutions across the country. And it isn't working for Indigenous students. Generations of us have been failed by this federal government and federal governments in previous because of their refusal to adequately fund the post-secondary student support program, also known as PcPherson. As a Métis person who's worked for years in the oil patch to pay for my university, I saw firsthand how the revolving door of Liberal and Conservative governments have broken the treaty obligation, and Indigenous youth have paid the price. This must change. But above all, the current model isn't working for students and graduates across Canada. Canadians are facing an affordability crisis. Rent, house prices, groceries, and now gas prices are skyrocketing. People across the country are finding it impossible to pay the bills and make ends meet. I see this every day in my riding. This economy in particular is brutal for young Canadians, and out-of-control tuition costs and the rising student debt that comes with it has placed a truly massive burden on my generation's shoulders. I want to be clear about something. Student debt and tuition are affordability issues. Right-wing premiers like Jason Kenney are making it even harder and harder for students to pay bills with their massive cuts. Some programs at the University of Alberta will see an increase of 104% next year. For the last 3 years, Alberta schools have received less government funding as tuition has increased, forcing students to pay more and get less if they want an education. This bill would help stop these short-sighted and reckless UCP cuts by creating a separate post-secondary transfer to the provinces. It is essential if we're going to stop the skyrocketing tuition fees and student debt that is causing so much harm to my home province of Alberta and across our country. And things have gotten much worse during the pandemic. When COVID hit us like a storm almost 2 years ago to this day, the federal government froze all student loan payments for 6 months. This was the bare minimum. But in September of 2020, the Liberal government made a shocking decision to restart student loan payments. They didn't even make any adjustments to the Repayment Assistance Program, also known as RAP, or the broken National Student Loan Service Centre. The results were devastating. Student unions like the Canadian Federation of Students, faculty unions like the Canadian Association of University Teachers, and the NDP fought hard to keep student loans frozen throughout the brutal winter of the second wave. But the Liberal government would not listen to common sense. MP Heather McPherson, my colleague, even passed a motion in the last Parliament of the House of Commons that called on the Liberal government to extend that freeze. But Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government refused to implement it. This week, I found out just how devastating this Liberal decision truly was for students. In just 12 months after the student loan repayment freeze was lifted, the federal government collected an astonishing $3.2 billion. That's a B, billion, in student debt from Canadians. They did this during one of the worst economic crises in our nation's history. Simply unacceptable and outrageous. I want to remind everyone that the United States, our neighbors just to the south of us, have frozen student loan payments for the last term and continuing to this president's term today. They expanded their federal student loan freeze and gave Americans some much-needed breathing room. Meanwhile, in Canada, Justin Trudeau's Liberals collected billions of dollars from struggling young Canadians during the worst period of this global pandemic. This shocking decision has horrific consequences for hundreds of thousands of people. The added burden of student loan payments during the pandemic destroyed credit scores, forced young people to take out payday loans, and made tough decisions between making rent and paying for groceries, all because the student loan payments just wouldn't stop. It's bad enough that students and graduates had to deal with cuts from right-wing premiers like Jason Kenney and Doug Ford, but it's truly shameful that Justin Trudeau's Liberal government refused to do the bare minimum by freezing student loans during the pandemic. Instead, they collected over $3.2 billion in student loan payments in just 1 year. New Democrats know that Canadians with student debt deserve better. We will fight hard for student debt cancellation and eventually make tuition free. The Canada Post-Secondary Act is a crucial first step to making this reality nationwide. Organizations representing faculty, staff, and students recognize how important it is to pass this bill. Many have been pushing for this legislation for years, and we're happy to be joined by Marie Dolcetti-Koros from the Canadian Federation of Students and Brenda Austin-Smith from the Canadian Association of University Teachers, who will now be making statements on behalf of their organizations. Kanamas kamtin awal.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Marie Dolcetti-Koros, and I'm happy to be here today representing the Canadian Federation of Students as the organization's national treasurer and incoming chairperson. The Federation is Canada's largest student organization, uniting over 500,000 undergraduate and graduate, international, and domestic students for more than 40 years. Over the past few weeks, the Federation has hosted more than 80 student delegates from across Canada to visit the Hill virtually for meetings with parliamentarians across party lines. There is growing consensus. The past few years have been extremely difficult on students, and they need help. Over the past 2 years, we've witnessed increases in job precarity, a rise in the cost of living, be it housing, food, gas, or the significant increases in tuition costs, and the detrimental impact isolation has had on our mental health. In fact, between 2000 and 2020, the average undergraduate tuition fee has increased by 115% in comparison to the overall consumer prices, which have increased by 44%. This is detailed in the Education for All report that is released today. It is very clear tuition costs are skyrocketing at unprecedented rates. Young people, Canadians, and parliamentarians alike all know that students are in crisis and need support. The Canada Post-Secondary Education Act brings us a step closer to ensuring that provinces and their post-secondary institutions prioritize accessible and affordable education for all by tying cash contributions to their ability to meet these objectives. Bill C-260 would lessen the financial burden on students by creating incentives through conditional funding for provinces that commit to prioritizing and funding post-secondary education. The Federation is proud to support Bill C-260, and we believe that it will bring us a step closer to the elimination of tuition fees and to the creation of a shared national vision for post-secondary education in Canada. The federal government needs to realize its role in enacting high-quality, accessible post-secondary education for all. We are grateful to be here in support of Bill C-260, and we will continue to work across party lines to advocate for students. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Brenda Austin-Smith, and I'm the president of the Canadian Association of University Teachers. And I'm really grateful to be here today to support this legislation. And on behalf of the over 72,000 teachers, researchers, librarians, and general staff across the country who are represented by the Canadian Association of University Teachers, I'm calling on the government and all other parties to support Bill 260. I've been teaching in the post-secondary education sector for over 25 years, and I have seen how much has changed. As Marie mentioned, the report we just released shows that tuition fees have been increasing far, far faster than inflation. Families now need to spend twice as much of their household budget as they did just a generation ago to go to college or university. And at the same time, as students are paying more, Working conditions on campuses are being hurt. More than a third of academic staff right now, that is, the people teaching the minds we're counting on to grow our economy and build our future, are stuck in short-term contracts. They don't know how long they're going to have a job. Some have no benefits whatsoever, and some are teaching at multiple institutions in multiple cities just to pay their bills. The current Canada social transfer is part of this problem. There's no way of knowing how much federal money is being used by the provinces to create affordable, high-quality, post-secondary education. And the old excuse that education is exclusively a provincial jurisdiction simply doesn't hold up in a reality with government federal investments in childcare and mental health, recent commitments on pharmacare and dental care, and a clear federal role in research and access to education for Indigenous learners. Affordable, high-quality, post-secondary education underpinned by adequately supported teachers, researchers, librarians, and staff is essential to ensuring the highly skilled, highly educated, and innovative population we need now. To get there, we need this legislation to become the law of Canada. And I am very, very happy to be here today and hope to see this come to fruition. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now it's time for questions. C'est la période de questions. We'll go to questions in the room first. One question, one follow-up. And for the speakers, there is interpretation if the question comes in a language that you're not as familiar with. Marie Wolf, Canadian Press.
Hello, I've got a two-pronged question, really. One is about the affordability of tuition fees. I just wondered if you felt there was a role for RESPs, which allow parents to save for their children's tuition fees with a top-up from the government, to be extended so that there is a pot of cash available to pay for these increasing fees. And if I may ask about, you talked about academics in insecure positions. What about the role of sessional lecturers? They have particularly insecure positions. There's no job security whatsoever. And I wondered if you felt that there should be some legal framework to ensure that they simply aren't, applying for jobs every single term.
I'll take the second part. That is exactly what I'm referring to when I refer to the contract academic staff, are sessionals. So what we know is that at least a third of people teaching students on colleges and university campuses are indeed those sessionals. I think this bill goes an awful long way to achieving exactly the kinds of ends that you referred to in your question, the kind of protections that we need.
Thanks for the question, and I think that when we're talking about how we support young people in particular and their hopes for achievements in post-secondary institutions, I think it's become more the norm for parents to be putting away money and putting away lots of it in order for their children to have the opportunity to succeed. But the reality is a lot of people don't have that. They don't have the parents that have high enough paying jobs that they can at simultaneous pay for groceries, rent, car, insurance, everything that's going up, and then put some away. We're seeing actually parents' ability to put away money decreasing. So we know that the affordability crisis is pushing students right to the edge, and they don't have enough money to get by, which is why something like this is why we know the federal government needs to step in, because we're predicting critical shortfalls for the ability for students to make ends meet, but particularly just their increase in institution, let alone any other fees. But great question, thank you.
Unrelated question to Blake, if I may. In the deal with the Liberals, one of the slightly ignored elements is the fact that it proposes that the polling day should be extended from 1 day to 3 days. And I presume this is designed to increase turnout. Now, I particularly wanted to ask Blake, who your campaign was very much based on getting the vote out, signing up people who'd never voted before. And I wondered if you felt that this might benefit Indigenous voters, people who find it hard to vote, people who are working 3 jobs, and what the rationale is. And also, if I may ask rather cheekily, do you think this is going to benefit the NDP?
That's a great question. And to answer the first portion of it, 3 days of election is appropriate considering how large our country is. When we think about Canada and we think about the urban centers, of course it's easy to walk down, 10 blocks to your polling station, cast a ballot, especially if you were working from home or had a 9 to 5 job. But there's a lot of Canadians, many Canadians who don't have that opportunity, who are flying across the country for their employment and may not be home at the time. But in particular to your question on Indigenous issues, what we see in this last election was truly horrific. We did not have polling stations in reserves. Many reserves in First Nations communities across Canada did not have that level of equity, and actually, in many cases, prohibited them from accessing or even wanting to vote. Canada has a historic problem with trying to get folks out to vote. We're seeing a decrease over time, and with COVID especially, we've seen apathy at an all-time high. We need to combat apathy in this country and restore trust in our democratic institutions, and ensuring that people have the availability and flexibility to cast their ballot in a fair democratic process will only increase the ability for Canadians to do so. On the question of whether or not it will help the NDP, I think it helps voters, yeah. It helps regular people who want to maybe participate, who otherwise don't have the opportunity, particularly working class people. When we think of what they need and the flexibility they need, it's those folks that are top of my mind when I think about how they get to the polls, particularly for families that often their parents are working multiple jobs and they're working 12 hours a day. It's not possible for them. And so I think that this is a good improvement for the country's democracy, and hopefully by the next election we'll see an increase in voter turnout.
Inès Lombardo, Franco Presse.
Merci. Bonjour, merci de prendre mes questions. Je m'excuse, mes questions ne vont pas porter tout à fait sur le projet de loi, mais sur le post-secondaire. En ce moment, il y a les états généraux sur le post-secondaire en contexte francophone minoritaire qui se déroulent, là en ce moment. Et puis moi, j'avais une question, puisque il est ressorti d'une étude l'an dernier que les francophones en situation minoritaire, il y avait un réel problème de financement, et qu'il y avait une grande différence avec les autres élèves. Voilà, donc je voulais savoir si vous pouviez commenter ce que le NPD a proposé par rapport à ça.
Thank you very much for the question. Just waiting for the translation to come through. Well, of course, you will know that the Campus Saint-Jean is a campus in my riding of Edmonton Strathcona, which is one of the only Francophone campus in Western Canada that can train the teachers that we require to meet our Charter 32 obligations. The only campus in Western Canada that will provide the teachers that we need to have, and provide the opportunity for Francophone students to study their university, take their post-secondary studies in French. It has been an incredibly difficult, challenging time for post-secondary institutions across Alberta under this current provincial government, but none so difficult as it has been for Campus Saint-Jean. We have seen, despite legal obligations by the provincial government and the University of Alberta, we have seen cuts to Campus Saint-Jean and the provincial government unwillingness to step up. I will congratulate the federal government for coming forward with some short-term funding and providing some gap funding that the provincial government was loath to accept. But it is not a solution. It is not a long-term solution if we are going to encourage Francophone studies across the country. This is a bilingual country. We are all very, very proud to be part of a bilingual country. My daughter is a student who has graduated from immersion programming. So we will continue to push on that. I think the federal government can do so much more to ensure universities like Laurentian University, universities like University of Alberta with Campus Saint Jean are given the support they need to provide the services that all Canadians, particularly Franco-Albertans, deserve.
Thank you. Je voulais aussi parler du projet de la sénatrice Lucie Mention, qui en automne a déposé un projet de loi pour éviter qu'un deuxième cas comme la Laurentienne se déroule. Donc je voulais savoir ce que vous en pensiez, ce que le NPD avait à dire là-dessus.
I'm not, so first of all, I'm not particularly aware of that legislation at this point, so I will have to look into that. Blake, did you, and so I think one of the things that we need to do is find those solutions to make sure that universities like Laurentian University are not able to abdicate the responsibilities that they have to their students, that they are protected. Because I think while we know that French is under attack across this country, French outside of Quebec is under particular risk. And we value that French immigration. It is so important to have in Edmonton, Strathcona, and across the country in terms of how it brings students to our area, how it diversifies our communities, and adds richness to our communities. So aside from the charter obligations, aside from the need for Francophone supports in place for kindergarten through K-12, I think that it's also vitally important for our immigration and vitally important for the survival of French outside of Quebec.
Okay, are there other questions in the room? And there's no one on Zoom. Merci beaucoup. That's it.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And yeah.